He went to King's College, Cambridge University on a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. He then spent 3 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, serving, among other things, as a rifle company commander. In 1959, he became a strategic analyst at the Rand Corporation and consultant to the Defense Department and the White House, specializing in problems of the command and control of nuclear weapons, nuclear war plans, and crisis decision-making. In 1961, he drafted the guidance from Secretary of Defense Robert M. McNamara to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the operational plans for general nuclear war. He was a member of 2 of the 3 working groups reporting to the Executive Committee of the National Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. He joined the Defense Department in 1964 as Special Assistant to Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, working on the escalation of the war in Vietnam. He transferred to the State Department in 1965 to serve 2 years at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, evaluating pacification in the field. On return to the Rand Corporation in 1967, Ellsberg worked on the top-secret McNamara study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, 1945 to 1968, which later became known as the Pentagon Papers. In 1969, he photocopied the 7,000-page study and gave it to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In 1971, he gave it to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers. His trial on 12 felony counts, posing a possible sentence of 115 years, was dismissed in 1973 on grounds of governmental misconduct against him, which led to the conviction of several White House aides and figured in the impeachment proceedings against President Nixon. This is history. This is American history. He's the author of 3 books, including The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, 2017. Dan lives in Kensington, California with his wife, Patricia Marks Ellsberg. Their son, Michael Ellsberg, is an author. His oldest son, Robert, is publisher and editor-in-chief of Orbis Books. His daughter, Mary, is the founding director of the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University. He has 5 grandchildren. Since the end of the Vietnam War, Ellsberg has been a lecturer, writer, and activist on the dangers of the nuclear era, wrongful U.S. intervention, and the urgent need for patriotic whistleblowing. I spoke with Dan over the last couple of days. He's been busy with interviews since the arrest of Julian Assange. So please direct your attention to the screens for Dan's talk to the conference.
Hi, I'm Dan Ellsberg. 60 years ago, a colleague of mine at Rand, Fat Charlie Herman Kahn, proposed a concept that he called the Doomsday Machine, a conceptual system that would, on the receipt of sensor inputs that indicated circumstances that occurred that the U.S. wanted to deter, would trigger the end of all life on Earth. As he said, a system that was an effective deterrent might be even cheaper and more reliable than our present, at that time, retaliatory system, could nevertheless be unacceptable. It would kill, as he put it, too many people, everyone in fact. And although it was feasible to do that, he thought at a cheaper cost, it simply would not be acceptable to anyone to create such a system, either the US nor anyone else. Around the same time, Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, and the mentor of most of the physicists in the Rand Physics Division, where I was working, proclaimed that at the very most, any use conceivable, the most destructive use possible of his invention, the H-bomb, could not kill more than a quarter of the Earth's population, not all of it. I thought of it at the time as a perception of the glass 3/4 full. But in any case, Teller was wrong, and Herman Kahn was wrong. Such a system did exist at that time and had for some years in the form of the Strategic Air Command, and soon to be supplemented by the Navy's Polaris, and eventually by hundreds or up to 1,000 Minuteman missiles, especially with multiple reentry vehicles. But as of 1961, the Joint Chiefs were not yet aware of the doomsday effect of their plans and of putting this system into motion. If I can leap ahead, there do exist two doomsday machines at least, and if testing were to resume and India and Pakistan were to get thermonuclear weapons, eventually North Korea, if that was allowed, other countries that might join them, there would be multiple doomsday machines, but at this point there are two, the US and Russian. That wasn't fully realized in 1961, when I held in my hand a piece of paper that had a chart answering a question that I had drafted for the Secretary of Defense, and it was sent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the name of the President from the National Security Council. The question was, if your plans are carried out as planned, and they were essentially first strike plans, either preemptive or escalating in support of our commitment in NATO to launch nuclear war and almost surely all-out nuclear war against the Soviet Union in various circumstances. If those plans were carried out as planned, how many people would be killed in the Soviet Union and China? And a week later, that answer was given in the form of a chart, top secret, sensitive, eyes only for the President. It was shown to me because in the White House because I had drafted the question. And the chart indicated how many people would die month by month from radioactive fallout, starting with the first casualties in the first days and week or so from blast and prompt radiation. The number was 325 million people. That was from a US first strike without counting Soviet retaliation. Evidently they did have a computer model, a very simple one. It was a linear chart that did answer my question, which I hadn't really expected. And so we sent another question down, how many would be killed in all from such a US attack? And within another week, a chart came back, this one not a graph, but a table, showing that another 100 million would be killed in East Europe, the satellite countries, as we call them, the slave nations, the captive nations, not our allies, but under occupation by the Soviet army. But airfields, transportation, not urban centers in East Europe, but command and control and air defenses in particular, would be hit, killing 100 million people there, in addition to the 325 million in the US and China. And at that time, there was no plan, as Eisenhower, and it had not yet been changed at all, for having any kind of armed conflict with the Soviet Union that did not include destroying China. In addition to that, 100 million would be killed by fallout from our strikes in our allied countries in West Europe, the NATO countries, by our own strikes. And a third additional 100 million in areas contiguous to the Soviet Union and China, mostly neutral countries like Austria, Finland, Afghanistan, just not as familiar a name then at that time as it is now, Japan, India, all of these. The total would be 600 million killed by our own strike, or 100 holocausts. That was a staggering discovery to me, to know not only that this was the effect of our planning, but that the Joint Chiefs were aware of this, had calculated it, planned on it, and were prepared to carry it out in alert forces all around the world, a number of which in the Pacific I had recently visited, actually seen the nuclear weapons involved, megaton nuclear weapons, on a study for the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Admiral Felt. I thought it was the most evil plan that had ever existed in the history of our species, and essentially insane. Those are two words, evil or immoral and insane, that we who have worked on arms control and studied strategic analyses of various kinds over the last decades have generally not seen in any of those papers. The various alternatives that are described and are prepared for in our budgeting year by year and are being prepared anew right now are simply taken as options, as looked at on their merits, supposedly, and not really examined in the case, in moral terms, I would say.
Okay, we had a glitch in the video. We're going to continue your video, and then we'll come back to you for questions and answers.
First, I should say, though, that was an underestimate. They were not seeing that as a doomsday machine at the time, although even in their own terms, it was a considerable underestimate. For example, as Lynn Eden has shown in her book, World on Fire, much later, the Joint Chiefs have never included fire in the result of their calculations of estimates, although that's the main effect of thermonuclear weapons, because it's regarded as too hard to calculate, depending on weather and fuel loading and exact nature of the weapons and so forth. Others have disputed that, but if you added that in, Lynn Eden calculated at least another 50% or so, carrying the effects of our own attack over 1 billion, and others have estimated even higher than that. When Soviet retaliation against Europe alone was added into that, that would take that 100 million in Europe, whether or not the wind was blowing in a way to carry the radioactive fallout. So we were talking about a third of the Earth's population, then 3 billion. But that too was a great underestimate, as we now know. From 1983 on, it's computer studies have shown, based on climatological models of environmental scientists, that the effects of burning cities, large cities, small cities, would loft the smoke from those cities into the stratosphere, where it would not rain out, where it would persist around the globe, carried around it quite quickly in a matter of days, for as much as a decade or longer. That we've known for the last 10 years or so, which have also seen confirmation of the original conjectures about these things, resolving many of the uncertainties that did exist in the 80s and early 90s, but almost all in an unfavorable direction to the survival of civilization. So this was in fact a true doomsday machine. The targeting included virtually every city, well, literally every city in the Soviet Union. My memory is that there were 211, I might be wrong, over 100,000. This targeted all of those and 80% of the cities, over 25,000. The same was true in China. The smoke from those cities is what would have destroyed most of the human species and all of the other larger animal species, which aren't as adaptable as ours. It wasn't, in the end, the fallout as conjectured on the beach around 1960, when it came out from a cobalt bomb, for example. Interestingly, a cobalt bomb apparently is what has just been put out for sea trials by Putin for Russia in the form of a drone submarine, or actually a drone torpedo released from a submarine, that Russian state television has described as having a 200 megaton warhead, which would create a tsunami offshore where it was released, perhaps 15 to 1,600 feet high, maybe a little larger than that, moving across perhaps 1,000 miles inland with radioactivity that would destroy all life. And that is supposed to have, or said to have, a cobalt shield for the first time, allowing for very long-lived lethal radioactivity. Should such a device exist, Russia proposes to deploy 32 such on 4 submarines. what are we to say of the very existence of such a weapon? After all, again, is it not evil, insane? Actually, the rationality to that is that it would get around all ABM, anti-ballistic missile defenses. It would easily avoid anti-submarine warfare. It could last off-land quite a bit. So it is an ultimate deterrent weapon. And in that sense is an answer to the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM treaty, supposed efforts to build up Space Command and ABM, and our ongoing anti-submarine warfare efforts to assure us, in other words, that there would be annihilation in any case. But is that a sane or moral, conceivably, answer? Is such a thing needed? Actually, for years, people have said, no, they wouldn't build it. Just that these were just rumors and bluff, because it wasn't needed. They could very obviously create pretty much the same effect without it. And that's true. But that didn't mean that they didn't build it and deploy it, and that it's going on now. By the way, some estimates of the warhead are very much smaller, perhaps as low as 2 megatons. But as I say, the state media over there have repeatedly said 100 to 200 megatons. And there seems little question that it could be increased to that extent. And they're not embarrassed to imply or to state that that is in fact what they're aiming at. The same is true, though, of our own first strike plans that have existed for a long time. Never in the form of preventive war. That's always been rejected, though it considered, at least under the Eisenhower administration, as a possibility, but rejected on the grounds that if being immoral against U.S. norms, but also that it was simply would result in too much damage to the world and to the U.S. as well. But in saying that we don't plan a first strike, that conceals an ambiguity that could be fatal. And that is that it has planned for a preemptive strike. The Strategic Air Command and now the Strategic Command have never really accepted the idea of riding out an attack, although Secretary McNamara talked about such things from time to time. But as Lynn Eden again showed in her interviews, and as I knew at the time, that's the idea of allowing most of our forces to be destroyed by an incoming attack before a president or his successor or alternative responded is anathema to most military officers. That has always been true on the Russian side as well. That means that a major leg of our triad, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are highly vulnerable to an attack by accurate missiles, Russian missiles, the same is true vice versa, there's a strong incentive to launch them on warning, which means that they could be sent off in the face of a false alarm of the kind that has occurred a number of times. At least several times, 1979, a couple times in 1980 on our side, very seriously in 1983 on the Russian side, and again a missile that was misinterpreted as an attack in 1995 after the Cold War. So the possibility has existed then of essentially destroying life on Earth as a real possibility. Anyone who said there was zero chance of that clearly would not know or was being disingenuous in describing that. Is it low? Undoubtedly, from year to year, it is low, except that Cold War conditions of a kind that are being resumed today and have been for the last several years make the interpretation of warning signals more plausible and more urgent, and increase the possibility of a false alarm war. Moreover, each side is now talking about first use, at least of tactical weapons, which against each other would almost surely escalate to all-out war. And that's talked about in connection with Ukraine, the Baltics, conceivably, Poland. Could arise, though less likely, even in Syria, if armed conflict for the first time did arise between the US and Russians. The question is why this has been accepted and what can be done about it. There is no necessity, conceivably, for us to have acquired this doomsday machine, or for that matter, for the Soviets from 64 and 65 on, after Khrushchev was ousted, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and other policy decisions. There was no necessity for the Soviet military to demand and get from Brezhnev essentially the equivalent of the American doomsday machine. China, for example, faced with threats from the US and Russia both, has never gone in that direction. They've had what amounts to a minimum deterrent. At first of dozens of long-range weapons, now up to 300 altogether, or something less than that, more than they can really justify on any reasonable calculation, and yet less than a tenth of what the US and Russia each possess. So from a human point of view of the civilization, these approaches are each, on each case, insane and immoral, and the same would be true of others that join them. Whatever case can be made, and there is a case that can be made, for deterrence in the form of some ability to retaliate in kind to a nuclear attack, does not remotely justify the actual machinery that has been acquired on both sides. Now, obviously, most of those weapons are not aimed at cities. They're aimed at, explicitly, they're aimed at military targets, silos, command and control, ranging up to air defense, and transport, conceivably urban industrial war industries as an addition. But even without that, that's most of the weapons on each side, and the weapons that, the targets that would be used in a preemptive attack, as having the rationality of limiting damage in the non-zero case where a nuclear war did actually occur. But again, since the mid-60s, it has been the case that each side, in targeting such supposedly military targets, would be burning cities enough to cause nuclear winter, thus wiping out any advantage of going first as opposed to going second. The core notion of the very large systems on both sides.
Okay, now we have a time for questions and answers. Anyone who would like to ask Dan a question, please come to the microphone over here.
May I say, by the way, that I was led to believe that the audience would be mainly students. It looks as though that's not the case. But I did, this was a talk not oriented to the arms controllers and the weapons analysts in the room who have all heard this from me before and know it themselves, or disagree with it themselves, that it was aimed at a more general audience. But I'd be happy to address any more technical or policy questions that you have.
I'm Terry Clark from North Carolina with PSR. And do the military planners in the United States and Russia think or believe they could prevail in a nuclear war?
That's a very relevant question. Whether they actually believe it, and people in a particular occupation get certain deformations of perspective, and when they work on it to try to solve a certain problem, they can possibly believe that they have achieved it or that it's feasible, even if it's fairly obvious to everybody else in the world that that's not the case. Since first of all, the planners, as far as I know, continue to use the word prevail. I think it was Secretary of Defense Weinberger who said at one point, anyone, Secretary of Defense, anyone who sits in this chair who isn't aiming at prevailing should be impeached, or he's in the wrong place. The fact is that since the mid-60s, when the Soviets developed enough submarines at sea that despite our anti-submarine warfare, it could easily destroy American society. And President Kennedy was told that as early as 1963, just before he died. That continued to be true. Since then, the idea of prevailing is just a word. In fact, again, another Secretary of Defense, I forget who it was, somebody there knows probably, said prevail is just a word that is good to use somehow. They also talk about winning, but actually, it has been the case even before nuclear winter was discovered in 1983 and since, that a war between the U.S. and Russia would result in the absolute destruction of both of their societies. And if they believe otherwise, in fact, I think they do believe that, but they still believe, I think, and this is a crucial hoax and myth and fantasy, I think, that is widely shared because it is very profitable for the aerospace industries and the air forces and the missile forces in both countries. Keeping in mind that Russia is now a capitalist country, has the same kind of corporate incentives to continue replacing and modernizing ICBMs, for example, that they had before. I call that the major hoax that has led to these enormous weapons forces on both sides, which constitute a doomsday machine, is that no matter how bad the other side's retaliation is to your first strike, it is better to strike first than second. And I think that is believed, and the operations and the plans are all based on that assumption. And since ICBMs, which are vulnerable to each other's ICBMs and even SLBMs, are on both sides, are vulnerable, each side has a launch on warning policy that is vulnerable to false alarms, which means that either side does face a genuine chance of being attacked by the other in case there's a false alarm. Moreover, as there have been in a number of cases, even when they have admitted, let's say, that early on, much earlier, in the early 60s, that a first strike would result in as many as 50 million or more American dead, an American first strike, they would say, but a second strike could be 150 million. And some people would raise the point, well, is there a real difference there in societal terms? And the answer was, well, 100 million people, which sounded impressive and made it seem plausible to the makers of missiles and others, and to the forces, the Air Force. At that time, the Polaris wasn't very good for counterforce. It is now, the Trident systems. But that made it seem plausible to launch on warning, to get your missiles off the ground before they could be destroyed, to get them over there to destroy the other's missiles before they could launch. That was even better. And that meant that any armed conflict between U.S. and Russians, which has not yet occurred since the Russian Revolution, since our involvement in Russia, actually in the 1918, 1919, there's been no overt conflict yet of the kind that's talked about recently in Syria or possibly in Ukraine or the Baltics or Poland, and then each side exercises for this. The fact is that if that began, each side would again quickly be thinking the other will be thinking that it's better to strike first than second, no matter how bad it is to strike first. And they will be thinking that that themselves. And so there's what's called instability, the real chance, even a likelihood, that any war will quickly lead to nuclear war, in limited form at least, between the U.S. and Russians, as we've always planned and still threaten, and that any limited form of nuclear war carries a high probability of escalating to all-out war. Since nuclear winter, I want to add, even the notion that should save X number of lives by striking first, even if you've lost a much larger number, is false. The fact is that a year after a major war, nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia, the result will be the same, whoever went first. A year from then, or in many countries, less than that, but in the U.S. and Russia, within a year, nearly everyone would have starved to death, whoever went first. So the notion of buying highly accurate weapons, more ICBMs, renewing them, MIRV, various cases, super fuses on the sub-launch missiles, all of this is as much of a fantasy as the notion that climate change is a fantasy, or that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, as many supporters of President Trump nowadays actually sincerely believe. The fact is that it's just a hoax. And thus, what I'm saying is that between the U.S. and Russia, the chance of prevailing or winning in any sense is totally illusory. And if you ask me, they believe in it. Yes, it serves their jobs, it serves their careers, it serves Boeing and Lockheed and their counterparts in Russia to imagine that or propose that and limit damage, act to limit damage in a nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia, which is absolutely infeasible. And that false belief sustains the maintenance of the doomsday machines on both sides, which both sides are working to do. Thanks for the question.
So yes, thank you very much. From a student's perspective, thank you very much for that presentation. And at the end, you really shared about just kind of briefly, really trying to create a change requires, really raising and creating awareness like we've never seen before. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, and especially from the perspective of looking at youth, like what we can do and what type of awareness and change that you were talking about.
I apologize, but I could hear only bits of that. I'm sorry. Can somebody tell me a little clearer what that was?
Yes. So just wanted to ask, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned about creating change and creating awareness like we've never seen before. So I wanted to ask if you could elaborate more on that, and especially from your perspective, looking at youth.
Okay, yeah. I did begin, for the sake, for those people who haven't read my book, with, which I'm sure as most people have. In fact, let me see, since I can see you, by hands. Has anybody there read my book? Can I see hands? Okay, handful. But I actually started with that chart of the 325 million and then the 600 million is dead. And I didn't quite say it in the book. I said I thought it was an evil plan, which is a very unusual word for a person in the Department of Defense. If you ever use that word in a meeting, by the way, you would never get in another meeting. And what I could say one further thing. I thought that the professional deformation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were proposing unapologetically that plan to kill more than 500 million people, really even more than that, meant that they had, from the experience of strategic bombing and then in the Second World War, wiping out cities by fire bombs, and then by doing the same with atom bombs and then H bombs, leading to this effect, had turned them into the equivalent of rabid dogs, that they were crazy, that I was working in a building here with 4-star generals that were crazy together. Individually, undoubtedly, looked like perfectly normal, ordinary family men. That's the ones I knew who worked on those plans. But in their professional capacities, were aiming at and pursuing a crazy, insane, and evil preparation. The second thing was this purely hypothetical? Was it purely for the interests of the anti-aerospace industry or their own services? Essentially a hoax. Khrushchev, after all, we later learned, later that year actually, had been actually bluffing, talking about wiping out the U.S. and turning out missiles like sausages without building the ICBMs. He didn't have them. But in this case, I knew we did have them, and they were on 10-minute alert. I'd seen that myself in the Pacific, like a giant slingshot, a David-like slingshot with nuclear warheads aimed to go off possibly on a false alarm. So it was a crazy system, and I thought the only way of dealing with it is from the inside. Working for Secretary McNamara, who did understand the craziness of this and said it in pretty much those terms to me, working for him and helping him try to get these people under control somehow and edge away. It was sort of the idea that you're not supposed to interfere with a sleepwalker too much because you may have violent consequences. But this so you had to edge him somehow, away from the cliff. But if he's going toward a cliff, which we were, what to do? It was a problem. I wish that I had expressed all the things I said here back in 1961, even though the prospects of accomplishing anything that did not seem very great. Congress was under the control of Southern reactionary militarists, basically, the committee chairman, seniority system then, and it seemed the only way you could do this was inside. Let me give one thought about what has to change here now, I think. The American people as a whole have not heard about this, have not discussed it, and whereas the experts in the audience there have known all this for a long time, I don't know if they're aware of just how ignorant the rest of the population is about this. There's been no discussion. Essentially, people thought the problem had gone away with the end of the Cold War, and it should have, but it didn't, and the weapons remained, and the process has remained. So one thing is informing them, and I'll mention one thing there. There has never been a congressional investigation of the impact of our weapon, of our plans on the environment or on climate. Nuclear winter studies were done in 1983, 36 years ago. During that time, so far as I've learned, there's been no real recognition of that, whether in the military or our planning. Ted Postal was aware of the planning much later and said that he had learned there had been no recognition of that. The National Academy of Sciences could conduct a study with classified data on the desired ground zeros, the yields, the air burst or ground burst, all that sort of thing, and see what the actual impact in terms of smoke, which has certainly, I think, not been considered at all, to the world, which has made hostages of everyone in the world and in effect treats as collateral damage the human species, essentially. So every legislature in the world has a right for their own people to demand that information over what a nuclear war between the US and Russia would mean for them. By the way, a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, it's been studied without the actual DGZs, without the targets or anything, but has been calculated, could easily starve by nuclear winter 2 billion people. Do they have a right to that mini doomsday machine, or to use it as, think of it as an option, or to prepare for it? It would seem not, but by our own example, of course, they do. So an investigation of this by Congress, which is the one that can get at our plans, and see which they've never done, would be very worthwhile, and tasking the NAS with that study would be worthwhile. There are other moves we could make that would greatly lower the risk, not to zero, of an all-out nuclear war, such as eliminating the ICBMs, which are lightning rods for attack, and which are prospects for launch on warning by ourselves or for escalation of any kind of conflict. The ICBMs should have gone 50 years ago, at least, since the Soviet submarines, in my opinion, made them anachronistic and absolutely incapable of limiting damage. So that would be, I understand, by the way, that Congressman Adam Smith is open to that idea of eliminating that triad. Actually, many people have been. James Mattis, General Mattis, was proposed that before he was Secretary of Defense, actually, and learned better when he ran into the buzzsaw of the Air Force and the aerospace industry when he got in and realized, oh, we did need a whole triad and the legs of that altogether. There should be no launch on warning on either side. Now, we can't ensure that that happens on the Soviet side, the Russian side. No nation can really reduce to an acceptable level, I would say, its own danger and the danger to the world all by its own actions, not by adding new weapons, not certainly by creating a threat of its own first strike that goes in the wrong direction, and that's what we're doing. But there has to be, ultimately, there are things that can be done unilaterally. I think that simply announcing no launch on warning would not do the job, and with great respect to Bruce Blair, who's the expert on this subject, I've always been skeptical of a de-alerting system which leaves the ICBMs in their holes, subject to attack by the other side. Granted, it is a political question here, what's more possible to do, but I would certainly much rather see the ICBMs dismantled and these super fuses. And finally, as I say, collaboration with the Russians is essential to really reduce this. They could eliminate the possibility of nuclear winter by their own action, by going down in the direction of the Chinese minimum deterrent, which they've always had, in which they're enlarging their system right now, but not to the point of in any way posing the kind of first strike threat and challenge the other side to launch on warning that we have. So there has to be collaboration here, and that the new Cold War, which has been kindled here by both parties, I would say, in the last several years, is not at all conducive to that kind of collaboration. By the way, Trump, of all people, changes from one day to the next, but he said something just recently about the U.S., Russia, and China all having too many weapons. The U.S. and Russia, of course, having more than 10 times more than the Chinese, but they should get together and reduce them. That should not be scorned just because it comes from Donald Trump. Very few people are wrong all the time about everything. And when he talks in that term, or with an agreement with North Korea that could put a freeze on their testing of missiles and warheads, I very much deplore people who sneer at that idea because they don't want Trump to get any credit.
We have run out of time,
Right.
and we really appreciate you joining us today. We wish you were here in person.
Okay.
The conference lasts until 4:30, and we could keep talking with you until then. But we have 6 other speakers. So, thank you for getting up early out there in California. And I hope to carry on our conversations in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful speakers. I'm so glad to see your stuff here.